Everyone loves complaining about Yu-Gi-Oh cards and Yu-Gi-Oh decks. People love saying this card is way too powerful, it's overpowered, and people love saying this card is terrible, why doesn't Konami buff it? We don't see a lot of videos out there, even on my own channel, where we reward Konami for designing cards in a good and meaningful way. In today's video, I'm going to break that trend. We're going to talk about 7 well-designed cards, but we're only focusing on generic cards, cards that are not tied to archetypes. And you might be asking yourself, well, what is a well-designed card? Well, there are a couple different criteria that I'm going to be looking at. The main one that I want to sort of keep in mind when we're talking about these cards is that they're good cards, but cards that aren't necessarily played in every single deck. You see, if a card is super bad, I don't think that means it's well designed. I think that means it's poorly designed because no one's playing it. But if a card is played in every single deck and there's no question about whether or not you add it to your deck, well, that's not very well designed either. We're looking for balanced cards that create meaningful decision trees both in deck building and when you're playing the card. I think when we factor in all of these different criteria, we can come to sort of a conclusion that there are certain cards that are better designed than other ones. What's also important to note is that even though these cards often saw play in some meta strategies, they never saw play in every deck, and also they never saw play in every single format. These cards definitely were popular during the eras that people were playing them the most, but they weren't cards that transcended every single format in all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. We want to look at cards that were good enough to be played consistently, but not too good to the point where every single person is asking for them to be banned on the next ban list. First up, I want to talk about the card that originally inspired me to make this video in the first place, and that's Pot of Duality. Now, on paper, Pot of Duality is a little bit better than Upstart Goblin if you ignore the restriction. Instead of randomly drawing the top card of your deck, you get a selection of the 3 top cards of your deck, and that adds a lot of skill-intensive decision-making because you get to choose what fits your hand better, and also it's interesting in regard to your opponent more so than Upstart Goblin because your opponent actually gets to not only see what you take, but also what you don't take, which means a good opponent could take what you just added to your hand and sort of piece together what the rest of your hand might be as long as they know what your strategy is trying to do. Of course, the card would be a little bit too good if it was just that effect, so Konami had to add the restriction that you can't special summon during the entire turn that you use Pot of Duality, and that adds just another level of skill in terms of deck building. Do you put this in a deck with as few special summons as possible, or do you play a deck with special summons but just have Pot of Duality to sort of get to certain combo pieces when you don't open the perfect hand? I know that might seem a little bit weird in 2019, but back when Pot of Duality came out, a lot of different decks played it, even ones that had sort of special summoning effects, just because the game was a lot less consistent back in the day. So Pot of Duality is like the trademark card that I think is well designed, and it's one that I want to put at the very beginning of today's video. Next up, we have a card that some people might think is tied down to an archetype, but it actually really isn't, and that is Trap Trick. So obviously this thing is based off of the Trap Tricks monsters or even in the artwork, but this card is most commonly seen play in decks that aren't Trap Tricks. Not a lot of people are playing that theme these days, but it is seen play in things like Altergeist and Trickstars, and even Salamangreats are taking advantage of Trap Trick. So why is this card so interesting? Well, from a deck building perspective, you can use extra copies of Trap Trick as extra copies of any normal trap card in your entire deck. This can lead to some cool things like people using Artifact Sanctum and Infinite Impermanence and even like the Salamangreat normal trap card all in the same deck, and Trap Trick just gives you extra opportunities to use those cards when you don't open them the normal way. This is also how it saw play in things like Altergeist, where it could set Metaverse, and in Trickstars, where it can set Trickstar Reincarnation. So from a deck building standpoint, people really are forced to change their deck strategy to actually fit in Trap Trick, and then when you're in the game, you not only have to decide when to use the Trap Trick because it locks you down for the rest of the turn, but also which card to set, because your opponent, even though they might not be able to play around the card that you set, they know what you're using, and also the opponent now knows you can only activate one trap card the entire turn. This is especially cool because in some situations you can set a card to bait your opponent into playing around that card, and then you can just activate a different card. You don't have to only activate the card you set. As long as you just activate only one trap card for the rest of the turn, it can be whatever you want it to be. Trap Trick is a really great example of modern, well-designed cards. We get a lot of cards right now that are either really bad or really good, but I think Trap Trick fits right in the middle to be a little bit interesting for a variety of decks without being overpowering. Another cool card that is not recent, but in fact quite the opposite, it's a very, very old card, is Scapegoat. Now, what makes Scapegoat a card worth discussing in this particular video? Well, what's cool about Scapegoat is that even though it has so many restrictions placed on it, you can't summon the turn you activated, the monsters that you summon can't be tributed, and the Scapegoat tokens themselves have 0 attack, 0 defense, and are level 1, despite all of these things, this card still pops up and has been popping up pretty much ever since it was created. So when it was first created, the main idea is that you were using it to sort of block attacks. You could block 4 attacks with one card. That's pretty cool, but that's not where Scapegoat stops. There are many more things you can do with the card. You can use Metamorphosis to summon Thousand Eyes Restrict. You can use Enemy Controller to tribute the tokens. You can even use the tokens for Synchro Summoning later on, and even nowadays, Scapegoat is still being used for Link Summoning using cards like Link Spider and Link Karibo. Scapegoat is just one of those cards that even though those little goat tokens don't look very powerful, you can just use them for so many different things as long as they're not tributing them, and that's why I think Scapegoat is really cool, but also the fact that the card is restricted by how fast it activates, because even though it's a quick play spell, which technically means it's very versatile, because you can't summon the turn that you use Scapegoat, you can't use it on your first turn. You can't aggressively activate Scapegoat and then make it a bunch of Link monsters, a bunch of Synchro monsters. You have to set it, you have to wait, your opponent has to have no back removal, and that's what makes Scapegoat so well designed in my opinion. Because of the way physical card games work, it's really hard to implement certain cards that work in online card games. I think of Hearthstone, where you have cards that sort of reward you for playing all singletons in your deck or only playing odd or even cards. Those types of ideas don't really work in a physical card game. However, Sekka's Light is probably the closest we'll ever get to that, and for that reason and other reasons, I think it's a very cool card, because Sekka's Light rewards players for building their deck in a very particular way. Technically, you can activate spells or traps before you use the card, but because of how the card is set up, it basically rewards a player for using only monster cards and then 3 copies of Sekka's Light. And oh boy is the reward good, because Sekka's Light is basically a better pot of greed as long as you meet the deck requirements. Not only do you get the draw 2 effect, which is obviously crazy, but also you get sort of a free shuffle effect as an extra mulligan bonus. For these reasons, I think Sekka's Light is awesome, and also the fact that when your opponent sees you activate a Sekka's Light, now they know you're not playing other cards like Twin Twisters or like Red Reboot, things along those lines. It also adds unique deck building decisions to side decks. We see players using things like Electric Virus instead of Mind Control in Thunder Dragon Sekka's Light deck list, just because that card is a monster card, which means they can keep the Sekka's Light in game 2 and 3. I really like this card. I thought it was cool and it was announced, and I'm really happy to see that it's seeing competitive play, but obviously it's not a staple card because many decks out there can't afford to play just 37 monster cards and 3 Sekka's Light. So while I understand this card is very hard to sort of duplicate, if Konami was ever to make a card similar to this one, it would be pretty difficult just from a design standpoint. I'm really happy that they made Sekka's Light, and it's always cool to see the different deck lists that people put out when they have to cut all of these spells and traps and just play monsters. I've said time and time again that I believe that Mind Crush is one of the best cards ever released in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I'll stand by that for this video. It's a card that on paper, yes, it seems really simple. You just let your opponent search a card and then you flip Mind Crush and get it out of their hand, but it's so much more than that. Not only does it teach awesome rulings to people, but also a skilled player can take advantage of Mind Crush in situations where an unskilled player cannot. You don't have to wait for your opponent to search something before you activate the Mind Crush. If they are making particular plays to telegraph certain cards in their hand, you can just flip the Mind Crush and get something out of their hand. You can also flip Mind Crush, purposely call it wrong, call like a god card because no one would play those, and then you discard your own cards to trigger graveyard effects. It's a really cool card. I'm super glad it's released, and it even has some crazy applications against fusion spells and ritual spells that in the hands of a skilled player can really make the difference between a game win or game loss. If your opponent activates a fusion or ritual spell, you can chain Mind Crush and call a card that you know that they have in their hand. In the case of fusion, sometimes that prevents the fusion summoning from happening altogether, and in the case of ritual summons, you can sometimes even call the monster they're trying to summon if you know what they're trying to bring out. Even in the case of Necroz, you could call things like Unicorn if they activated Kaleidoscope, and that can force them to either stop the ritual summon completely or make a really awkward ritual summon with cards that they didn't plan on using in the first place. Mind Crush is a card that does not see play in every single format, but it sees play in some formats in a variety of ways, and that's why I think it's an awesomely designed card. While it is true that Pot of Duality is the original reason I wanted to do this discussion, Pot of Desires is the card that made me want to turn the discussion into not a one-card discussion, but try to find other cards as well. Pot of Desires is basically the new Pot of Duality. It's played in a lot of different decks and has seen a ton of experimentation in so many different ways it's hard to count, but I'll try to sort of cover them here. So the reason I love Pot of Desires and the reason I think it's a well-designed card is because it's so polarizing. You know, people saying it's the best card in the game and people saying this is the worst card in the game. There's so much experimentation with this card. People, when it first came out, were playing like 46 cards decks just with Pot of Desires, so they didn't always banish their key combo pieces. Do you play multiples of cards you don't want to banish, or do you just play singletons and hope you get lucky? Do you activate Pot of Desires when your turn starts or after you started your combos? Do you let your opponent use an Ash Blossom on Pot of Desires to help your other plays go through, or do you let your normal plays get Ash Blossom to help the Pot of Desires go through? There are so many different decisions you have to make, not only when you play Pot of Desires, but when you build a deck with Pot of Desires. I love Pot of Desires. You guys are probably sick of hearing me talk about it, but I truly do feel it is one of Konami's greatest achievements and probably the best balancing act of Pot of Greed. Just by banishing the top 10 cards of your deck face down, it adds so much discussion to a card that without that is obviously way too good for the game. Pot of Greed probably can't come back, but when you add a huge requirement like banishing the top 10 cards of your deck face down, that adds a lot of interesting discussion and polarizing standpoints, and that's why I love the card so much. And lastly, we have an old school card that many of you are probably not familiar with. Even though some of the cards on this list are technically older than Gores, the Emissary of Darkness, many of them have seen play in more recent years than this card. But don't get me wrong, Gores is one of the most well-designed cards out there. It's a card that in the hands of a skilled player can punish the worst of players out there, and that's why the card is so well designed, because against good players, Gores is usually not that fantastic. It's against worse players where this card really shines. Players that have 5 monsters on board, one of which has 3,000 attack and 4 of which have 2,000 attack, sometimes they'll attack with the 3,000 attack monster first, and then you just drop Gores, summon the token with 3,000 defense in defense position, and now your opponent can't OTK you. This is a card that punishes players for not knowing it exists, and it's one of the cards that a lot of people, when I posted this sort of question on Twitter about which cards are most well designed, a lot of people commented that Gores is so good. You can even play this in decks where there are back row cards. Your opponent spends the time to play through all of your back row cards, and they're like, well, he's probably not playing Gores because he had so much back row, especially if some of those back row cards were continuous, like Call of the Haunted, and then they just attack into the Gores and you immediately punish them. This card isn't so good anymore, probably the worst card on this list by modern standards, but still, it cemented its place in Yu-Gi-Oh's history because of how useful it was in a variety of situations. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on 7 well-designed generic Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Let me know in the comment section below what some well-designed archetype cards you guys think are out there. I have a few ideas for that video. We'll probably be posting that next week, so make sure to stay tuned for that. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.